this is another book review video. This time, this book here. Once again, I've been reading about the Industrial Revolution, and if you are interested in the subject, this might be a very good book to read. It's called The British Industrial Revolution in Global Perspective, and what the author primarily is trying to do is explain why the Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain first, and much earlier than other countries. What was unique about the conditions in the UK, which enabled it in the latter part of the 18th century to industrialise, that is to say, to build factories and have a general trend towards urbanisation and people moving to cities to work in factories, producing goods, using automated equipment that ran on steam, water and wind in some cases too, rather than hands. And so that's what the Industrial Revolution was about the use of machines to produce goods and services that people could buy within the UK. But the key argument, if I was to summarise the main thesis of the book, so what the main argument is, rather than looking at what was culturally different about the UK just prior to the Industrial Revolution. So for example, last week I reviewed Joel Mockyer's book called Enlightenment, Industrial Enlightenment, and that book is primarily about cultural changes that took place, philosophical developments, and a greater appreciation of science and mathematics, away from superstition and religious dogmatism. That's the main point I think Joel Mockyer tries to get across in his book. So he argues that this was quite unique in the UK. Also, there was much more of an emphasis on using science in useful, productive ways, rather than sort of as abstract theory that explained various phenomena. The emphasis there, which came from Francis Bacon and the Royal Society, was how can we use understanding of how things work and apply it in the real world to the benefit of society. And that was what Joel Mockyer focused on in his book, which tried to explain why Britain was a unique place in the lead up to the Industrial Revolution. What this book argues is that it was primarily economical, and the main argument is that Britain had cheap energy, an abundance of coal in the northeast, for example, up in Newcastle and County Durham, and that wasn't common. He compares the UK with China quite a lot, and other Western European countries as well. Belgium was another country which had cheap coal, and Belgium was one of the first to industrialise as well, but Britain was the first. There was a great incentive to use the coal, to use energy to power machines, and of course to invent machines. The two go hand in hand, because wages were very high in the UK as well. And that really is the main argument of the book, is that the UK, just prior to the Industrial Revolution, was a high wage, cheap energy economy, whereas China was the opposite. It was a cheap labour, high costing energy type economy. And so the desire to replace labour, that is workers, with machines, was very strong in Britain because of how cheap burning coal was. The origins of why wages were high in the UK. Um, in the book, he argues for two main reasons why this was so. The first is that he traces the high wage economy back to the Black Death in the 14th century, and of course, throughout Western Europe, around half the population died during the Black Death, and with a smaller population, less workers, this resulted in wages going up because shortage of labour means that wages for labourers increases because there's less competition. So he says this was quite a big factor. There were some others as well. So in comparing the UK with China, he compares the culture of the two, and he, in this book, puts forward an argument that the UK, men and women deferred marriage, so they married later than in China. In China, one aspect of their culture is ancestor worship, and the belief that children should look after parents in their old age. And so women in China, we're talking about the 18th century, married earlier and by logical extension had more children, whereas in the UK, women could work in the cottage industries, and because it was a high wage economy, they were less dependent on marriage. They didn't need men as much as possibly in other parts of the world. They could support themselves financially, and so they married later, or tended to marry later. And the same with men, they tended to marry once they had a stable job and a stable income. And so that's a cultural aspect of the equation. But he puts forward those two main reasons why wages were particularly high in the UK. Another key point he makes in this book is that Britain was one of the first to industrialise because it was one of the first to urbanise, particularly to the extent to which Britain urbanised. So huge migration of people from the countryside into cities, and rather than the traditional view, which is that was powered by the agricultural revolution, in other words, machines replacing workers in the fields means that workers in the fields become workers in the city. Actually, he says this isn't quite true. It's not a matter of pushing people into the cities. What happened was that because Britain became a key global trading nation, in other words, there were jobs in cities, in factories that were high paying, had huge demand for labour, and a lot of people working in the farm were attracted to those jobs in cities, particularly to London, which was one of the reasons why wood in the UK became very scarce. This was another factor which led to the importance of the coal industry in Britain, was that there was a shortage of wood, and that was largely a consequence of urbanisation, because of course if you're building growing cities, particularly London, that construction, all of those homes and buildings, they're going to require wood, and so this led to a shortage of wood, thus meaning that coal and the extraction of it and the transportation within the UK became increasingly important. And so the book goes into all of these things in quite some detail, but the fact that London was a busy trading port, sending various goods to its various colonies in North America, in India and in the Far East, this led, in his view, to greater it led to the agricultural revolution, which preceded the industrial revolution, in that the growth of cities demanded greater food supply, and this meant that things like enclosure, things like the invention of machines used in farming, and better farming practices overall, particularly as enclosure meant a greater sense of profitability. The motivation behind enclosure, first and foremost, is about profitability. The owners or potential owners of a piece of land want it enclosed in order to plan and ensure that they maximise their profits. They're using that land to grow vegetables or to use it as pasture in the most efficient way possible. And so the growth of cities leads to agricultural revolution, and the two go hand in hand. Towards the end of the book, he talks about how rapid urbanisation and industrialisation led to greater rates of literacy and numeracy, because of course if people are needing to work in factories, measuring things in an accurate manner becomes increasingly important. Weighing things and buying things, and the whole nature of a capitalist economy, which is about being precise with the way things are measured, bought and sold, requires a high degree of numeracy. And of course businesses need to be numerate because for their accounting purposes, and so all of this began to improve. So it became a self-perpetuating virtuous cycle, really, where all of these factors were in alignment and led to Great Britain becoming the global superpower of the 19th century. The book doesn't go into how the Industrial Revolution was exported in any great detail, because primarily it focuses on the UK. But I would say as a starting point, this is a very good book to read. You get lots of data and some interesting graphs, and clearly the author has conducted an in-depth inquiry and investigation into actual facts and actual numbers. So it's not hogwash, it's actually using plausible, and he's done his best to find accurate data. I'll just show you a few graphs before we end the video to give you a flavour of what one can learn from reading this book. It might be helpful just to see some of the things that he talks about. So I'll just show you two graphs which may help to illustrate the point. Should have done this before, but anyway, you can see this graph here, and this represents the price of labour relative to energy early in the 1700s. So you can see major cities there, and as you can see, Newcastle is way up, and that really is due to the cheapness of coal. And you can see a great incentive there for that coal to be taken out of the ground, burned, and used to power machines, which produce goods that are then sold to overseas countries. And the strength of the British Navy, the Royal Navy, also key in maintaining and sustaining those global networks. Doesn't talk about this in the book, but one of the logical reasons why Britain was able to have a strong navy, or why it was important, is simply because it's an island, and defending the island in those times only required a strong navy, because the only way it could be attacked was by the sea. So I believe that that's probably an underestimated factor in explaining why the UK had such a far-reaching empire, and that empire was fundamentally a trading global network, but built on the foundation of having a defendable island. He doesn't really go into that particular factor in this book, but it seems to me logical that that's also clearly a big factor, and why possibly on the continent in Europe there was always some danger of war between countries. That was always in the air, so to speak. And so in the UK, possibly that helped create a more settled community in which property rights and contracts could be developed. So let me just see if I can find you one more graph, and then you can check the book out for yourself. In fact, I won't show you a graph, I'll show you a chart, because it really summarises the book in one nicely put together chart. But you can see there are all of the factors that the book goes into in quite some detail. So if you're interested in the Industrial Revolution, and if you're studying economics or you're interested in economics, then the Industrial Revolution is very much worth learning about, because in understanding the Industrial Revolution and how that led to economic prosperity in the UK but all across the world, you're looking at real economics, what actually drives progress, what actually leads to material elevation in living standards, and all of the things that we enjoy in the modern world. So thanks for watching. Next week I will post another video. Stay tuned.